Thank you very much, all of you, for the excellent presentations. It's really fabulous to see your work again for me. And I'm actually going to start off with a quote from Carl Linnaeus that Jenny mentioned in her presentation. In 1751, in his Philosophica Botanica, he stated, "If you do not know the name of things, the knowledge of them is lost too," which suggests that if something can't be classified, then it doesn't exist. And when thinking about that in terms of museums, many of which in the late 18th century, of course, adopted Linnaeus's universal system, I thought it was interesting to think about it in terms of your work too, because naming plays a very big part in all of your work. Jenny, your use of native and non-native and alien. Beatriz, in terms of your, avocado, your Californian avocado, which is not from California, and Karen, in terms of your Victoria or Amazonia, Victoria. Thank you, Victoria Amazonia. And so I was wondering, and it plays a very big part in terms of how you frame your narratives in your work. And so I was wondering how you would respond to this Linnaeus quote.
Is it on? Okay. There's a wonderful book written by Carol Kasich-Yoon that's called Naming Nature. And I found her detailing of sort of the ways we've been limited in this naming system that we've adopted within the Western cultures that were, or at least in my project that I'm sort of speaking to. These names, they have a deep impact in the way we can see and the kinds of connections between things that we accept or that we think as logical. And one of the things that she's exploring in this book is that these names are not a logical system all by themselves. So for instance, she brings up actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm not actually the best at remembering names, so that's an interesting thing. But she brings up a culture that lives in the rainforest, whose way or method of naming is all about the plants' relationships one to the other. And so you can't know the name of one thing without knowing its relationship through three other plants, which it has a biological relationship to, in terms of, like, you could think of it as the toxin and the cure. So they don't make sense without understanding both. Whereas the Linnaean system is more about, do they have the same, like I said, phenotype, which just means, do they have the same similar look or, genetic qualities? It totally takes away their interrelatedness to one another. So I would say that's...
May I say something? Yeah, please. So I actually think that taxonomy, or like the identification of plants, is deeply problematic, particularly plant exploration, which is generally for imperial gain in other parts of the world. So plants that are named to whom and by whom? Plants that are named by people from Western cultures for the benefit of people from Western cultures. Is that, how does, I don't understand, like, because usually they already have a name. That a plant gets discovered and gets named after Queen Victoria is fucking ridiculous, right? Like, it's obviously had a name for thousands of years. It's a super majestic plant that has an important role in the culture. So it's a lot of taxonomy, or modern taxonomy in the sense of, particularly in the tropics, is deeply, deeply problematic. Even plant identification, discovery, as good as their intentions were, people going like deep into the rainforest to identify plants for medicines that can be used in the West or whatever. It's just basically how can we best sack things from people that don't generally get much benefit from that, and often suffer. And it's just like economic imperialism through discovery, and the idea of discovery itself is super problematic. So anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely with what you're saying, and for me, plants are kind of weaving together the memory of both this imperialistic colonization of other lands and at the same time of our migration. And I think that on the one hand, it's important to remember that plants don't have one name, they have many names, and they have been named for different reasons. And I'm interested in that very much. For example, in the gardens here in Los Angeles, there are lots of things that disappear. The history of the plants that are there, where did they come from? One of the things that I have been obsessively looking at is the very marked invisibility of the Japanese gardeners that grew a lot of the plants that are at the Huntington Gardens and at the Descanso Gardens before they were sent to Manzanar, and their plants were, quote, bought for a fair price by those gardens and institutions. And I think, you know, there's also this really important naming in Latin by scientific discourse that imposes a genealogy that goes to the Greeks and that reconstitutes Eurocentric thought. And then for me as an artist, and also in my collaborations with Rafa Esparza, it has been important to look at the fact that there isn't one culture, and not in the Amazon, not in Central America. There are lots of cultures that live with the plants. And so, for example, even, you know, when we're naming the contents of our gardens, we always say this is a chayote and this is a whiskey, because it's a chayote for Rafa, whose heritage comes from the Aztecs, and it's a whiskey for me because I live in a land that's populated by the Pipil. And so the same plant is not the same name for us, and we didn't want to prioritize any one of the two names. And so even that, you know, is also important in terms of giving visibility to different indigenous groups.
Like a lot of plants in the Amazon, for example, have like between 12 and 20, 30, 40, 50 names.
And just to sort of carry on from that a little bit, you know, all three of you talk about, you know, legacies of colonialism, as well as, you know, current issues around race, nationalism, borders and immigration. Why is the plant form so effective to talk about these issues?
Well, for me, it became important as I was reading all these philosophers that were talking about the markings on the stone, the end of the Anthropocene, and the markings on the sedimentation layers. To me, it became important to think about the fact that humans are going to disappear, but that doesn't mean that because our species is not here, plants are not going to be here. And I wanted to imagine the end of the Anthropocene, but not the end of plants. And I wanted to also imagine that the way that we have moved plants, just like Jenny was explaining, for our benefit, and also for our pleasure, for our joy, and also for the preservation of culture and knowledge, as you were saying, and medicine and spirituality, all those reasons are marked in the way in which plants have moved through the planet. And so I was really interested in thinking about plants as a way to preserve memory, because plants would survive beyond the human and become another way in which the marks of the Anthropocene would remain beyond our existence on the planet.
So I have a spiritual relationship with plants, I think. I mean, like, I talk to plants. I kind of always have talked to plants. This is great, this feedback. Like I was born kind of and raised as a gardener, and always like very much in dialogue with ecology and with plants, and like actually like really talking to plants. I believe that they have a type of consciousness. There is a vegetal consciousness. It's different from human consciousness. It's very different. But I believe that they are spiritual. I think that even the fact that they exist and we can ingest them and they do all kinds of different things to us, it's really fascinating. Our relationship with them is super complex and super beautiful. I'm a plant person, and that's why I make work about that sometimes.
My route to plants was actually not obvious. My mom, really serious gardener, planted her own mini Huntington in her backyard, 133 roses that I had to water and take care of, and I did not enjoy that. But then I moved into the forest in Sweden, and actually, before I even moved into the forest, I started to spend a lot more time there, and learning how to read it. And then I understood how to listen to it and see it fully for what it was. And I mean that in terms of foraging, mushrooms and berries, and also just recognizing why certain plants were growing in certain places and what they were doing, and how they reflected us, how they literally reflected our tracks, and what other tracks you could read through that. It just felt like the entire world opened up in front of my eyes. And it's interesting because I feel like growing up in a very urban environment, they felt benign, or like something that you create a garden, it's controlled, it's you say what belongs and what doesn't. And then having that experience was actually a radical awakening for me, and felt like a reset. And then once I encountered the Blacklist, it became a really interesting space, I thought, to see why there was such a heavy subtext being placed on these plants, why such ominous tones were being used to describe their reason for not belonging here, or not the desire for them, or calling them undesirable, basically.
And just to go back to what Beatriz was saying, in addition to using plants to examine a here and now and certain histories, all of you either point directly or nod towards, the post-human. You talk about it quite a bit. But also, as both Karen and Beatriz have pointed out in texts that I've read from you and also in your presentation, is that in terms of the history of this planet, humans represent just this tiny interruption in the Earth's history. So would any of you like to comment on this in relationship to non-human forms of intelligence and to the decentering of the human?
I think I began thinking about this, trying to think about chronologies that went beyond humans. Maybe thinking about something kind of like the hyperobject, but also about thinking about collapsing time and warping time. And so in my work, I began to think about, for example, those rocks that I was telling you that came from under the ice, and as the ice was melting, they were being dragged downstream in Wisconsin. That was an example of a rock that did not belong to the Anthropocene, and that we were not meant to coexist with, and that seeing that rock meant that the planet is warming up and that the humans are going to go. And so imagining not only the human outside the center, but imagining a world that is not necessarily meant for humans, and that many eras have already happened without us on this planet, and others will too, became really important, because displacing humanism for me also was a way to displace colonialism, and that reason that believes in truth and believes in certainty and believes in positivism was a way to displace the colonialism that came with Eurocentric thought. And so displacing humanism for me didn't mean completely erasing the traces of humans from the earth, but it meant for me disrespecting that kind of reason and that kind of logic, displacing it from my world as I was making my work, and trying to listen to other voices that also exist in the human era that are silenced by that kind of reason. Do you want to use just one mic? Yeah, is there some battle of the mics?
So in terms of, I guess I'm not thinking that much about post-human, but more just about culture, and I mean, certainly this empire will fall, as all empires have fallen. We're looking at a very late stage in American capitalism, and it's causing all kinds of violence. So the violence presented to us by climate change, for example, we're looking at the extinction of 20 million species over the next 10 years. I mean, so I think humans are cursed at the moment. I think we've cursed ourselves. I think there might be ways out, but we've got to do some pretty fancy footwork. We're drinking like pearls and copper at the moment, and trying to balance ourselves, balance our energies, mindfulness practices, all this. It's not garbage. It's just like it doesn't look at the problem. The problem is capitalism. The problem is greed, and the problem is species extinction, and that we're going to self-obliterate. So. I guess I do think about post-human environments a little bit. It occupies a little bit of my thought. Yeah, we're so young as a species. We're so young. Our written history is 10,000 years. You know what that is in the history of the world? Like, let's talk to a rock about it and see what they have to say. Seriously, like a grain of sand is older than our whole species. Anyway, I'll pass this on.
There's a lot that I agree with that you both have just said. So I think it's difficult because as a species, I think we're always looking towards, it's almost like that capitalist mentality as far as this culture is concerned right here. I'm not speaking for the whole species. I can't do that. But if we think about everything in terms of resource and its benefit to us, that's, I think, maybe at the root of the anthropocentric age we're in. At this point in time, and so it's going to take a radical recentering if we're going to survive as a species. Whether we ought to or not, I can't argue that. I think that's just for this earth that's housing us for the moment to decide.
So I think we have to come to a close. Is that right, Robert? Okay. So let's give these artists a huge round of applause.